was the most uncomfortable briefing in the history of joint special operations in Vietnam. In late 1968, a senior Australian SAS sergeant stood in a sandbagged hut at Nui Dat, looked across a table at 3 Green Beret officers from the 5th Special Forces Group, and told them something no American wanted to hear. He said, "Your tactics will kill you. Every procedure you follow, every instinct you trust, every piece of equipment you carry, it is designed to get you detected and destroyed. And until you accept that, you will keep dying at rates that make no sense." The Americans didn't accept it. They walked out. One of them reportedly muttered that he didn't fly 6,000 miles to take advice from a country that lost a war to emus. He was referencing Australia's infamous 1932 attempt to cull emu populations with military machine guns, a campaign the birds technically won. It was a good joke. It was also the last joke that officer would make about Australians, because 3 weeks later his 12-man recon team was inserted into the jungle near the Cambodian border. 9 went in. 3 came out. The Viet Cong had heard them coming from 400 meters away. They had smelled them before they saw them. They had tracked their boot prints to a night defensive position and waited for dawn. The ambush lasted 11 seconds, and as the survivors were extracted by helicopter, broken and bleeding and screaming for medevac, the Australian SAS were conducting their own operation less than 20 kilometers away. 5 men, 17 days in the bush, 0 casualties, 14 confirmed enemy eliminated, not a single shot heard beyond 50 meters. This is the story of what happened when 2 of the most elite special operations forces on Earth operated side by side in the same war, in the same jungle, against the same enemy, and achieved results so wildly different that the gap could not be explained by courage or training or equipment. It could only be explained by philosophy, by a fundamental disagreement about the nature of warfare itself. The Green Berets believed the jungle was a battlefield. The Australians believed the jungle was home. That difference killed men, and the Pentagon spent decades pretending it didn't. To understand the collision between these 2 forces, you have to understand what each of them was built to do, and how the jungles of Vietnam exposed the gap between their doctrines with lethal clarity. The United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, were born from the ashes of the Office of Strategic Services, the legendary OSS that had operated behind enemy lines in World War II. Activated in 1952 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, they were designed as unconventional warfare specialists capable of training indigenous forces, conducting sabotage, and operating in denied territory. President John F. Kennedy himself championed them, calling the Green Beret a symbol of excellence, a badge of courage, a mark of distinction in the fight for freedom. By 1964, the 5th Special Forces Group had deployed to Vietnam, establishing its headquarters in Nha Trang and spreading A-teams across the country's most dangerous provinces. These 12-man detachments trained Montagnard tribesmen, ethnic Nung fighters, and South Vietnamese irregulars in the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program. They manned isolated camps along the Cambodian and Laotian borders. They ran cross-border reconnaissance missions so secret that the men who conducted them removed their dog tags and identification before insertion. The Green Berets were extraordinary soldiers by any measure. Their qualification course was among the most demanding military training programs in the world. Candidates endured months of selection and assessment before even beginning the core curriculum. Each man was trained in a specialty: weapons, demolitions, communications, medicine, engineering, and then cross-trained in at least one other. They spoke foreign languages, many of them fluently. They understood guerrilla warfare doctrine at a theoretical level that few conventional officers could match. They had studied Mao's writings on insurgency, Ho Chi Minh's methods, the lessons of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. On paper, they were precisely the force America needed for the war it was fighting. In practice, they were constrained by the very institution that created them. The Green Berets understood counterinsurgency in theory, but operated within a command structure that measured success in body counts and territory seized. Their A-teams in the CIDG camps did exceptional work, training indigenous fighters and building relationships with Montagnard communities, work that represented genuine counterinsurgency at its best. But when it came to direct action, reconnaissance, and patrol operations, they defaulted to American methods because those were the methods their doctrine prescribed, their logistics supported, and their chain of command demanded. The most dangerous assumption embedded in those methods was this: that technological superiority and aggressive action would always produce results. The American way of war, refined through 2 world wars and Korea, was fundamentally about bringing overwhelming force to bear on a problem. When Green Beret recon teams made contact with the enemy, their immediate response was to call for extraction, air support, artillery, the full weight of American firepower. Their movement speed through the jungle averaged between 1 and 3 kilometers per day. Their patrols carried American rations, wore American uniforms, maintained American hygiene standards. They smelled like American soap, American insect repellent, American cigarettes, and they died at rates that should have been unacceptable. MACVSOG, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, ran the most classified and dangerous missions of the entire war. Their recon teams operated across the borders of Laos and Cambodia, deep inside enemy-controlled territory along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where North Vietnamese Army divisions moved men and materiel south under canopies so thick that satellites could not penetrate them. A typical SOG spike team consisted of 2 or 3 Americans and 4 to 6 indigenous soldiers, Montagnards, ethnic Nung fighters, or South Vietnamese commandos. They inserted by helicopter into landing zones so small the rotors clipped the treetops, and they operated in areas where the enemy outnumbered them by a factor of 1,000 to 1. The casualty statistics were beyond staggering. They were medieval. In 1968 alone, every single SOG recon man was wounded at least once, and roughly half were killed. The overall casualty rate exceeded 100%, meaning the unit's entire roster turned over more than once in a single year through death and injury. At least 11 SOG teams simply vanished during operations, their fates never determined, their remains never recovered. The North Vietnamese created specially trained sapper units whose sole purpose was to hunt and destroy these small American teams. They even offered what amounted to a bounty medal for any NVA soldier who killed a SOG recon man. These were among the bravest and most skilled soldiers America has ever produced. Men whose names read like a roster of legends: Billy Waugh, Dick Meadows, Jerry Mad Dog Shriver, Roy Benavidez, Robert Howard. 9 SOG operators received the Medal of Honor, and yet they were being ground into dust by an enemy that could detect them almost at will. The fundamental problem was not courage or skill. The fundamental problem was that the enemy could hear them, smell them, and track them from the moment they touched the ground. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam with a fundamentally different history and a fundamentally different set of assumptions. Formed in 1957 and modeled on the British SAS, the regiment traced its philosophical lineage not just to the wartime British Special Forces, but further back, to the Australian commandos and independent companies that had fought the Japanese in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, Timor, and the islands of the South Pacific during World War II. Those units had operated for months behind enemy lines, virtually self-sufficient, winning the trust of local populations while conducting reconnaissance and guerrilla operations against a numerically superior enemy. The tradition of small unit jungle operations was not new to Australia. It was embedded in the country's military DNA. During the Indonesian confrontation of 1965 and 1966, Australian SAS operators conducted long-range patrols in the jungles of Borneo, including secret cross-border operations into Indonesian territory. They tracked communist insurgents through terrain so dense that visibility sometimes dropped below 3 meters. Living in the Yeo jungle for weeks at a time, they learned to read the environment the way a farmer reads weather, instinctively, continuously, without conscious effort. What they learned in those Borneo jungles would prove directly applicable to Vietnam, and it would transform them into something the Viet Cong had never encountered. The Australians deployed to Puoc Tuy Province in 1966 as part of the 1st Australian Task Force based at Nui Dat. Unlike American units that rotated individual soldiers in and out on 12-month tours, the Australians deployed as formed units, building unit cohesion and institutional memory that compounded over successive rotations. The SAS component was tiny, never more than about 150 men in country at any given time, with 3 Sabre squadrons rotating through on year-long deployments. Their official role was reconnaissance, serving as the eyes and ears of the task force, providing intelligence on enemy movements and dispositions. Their actual function went considerably beyond that, but the numbers they produced over 6 years of operations defied rational military analysis. The Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They inflicted approximately 500 confirmed kills on the enemy. Their own losses totaled 1 man killed in action, 1 who died of wounds, 3 killed accidentally, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded. The kill ratio was so extreme that American analysts initially assumed the Australians were fabricating their reports. They were not fabricating anything. They were simply fighting a different war. The friction between Green Berets and Australian SAS didn't begin with a single confrontation. It accumulated through dozens of interactions across multiple years. At Nui Dat, at Vung Tau, at joint planning sessions, at the MACV Recondo school in Nha Trang, where Australian instructors taught long-range patrol techniques to American soldiers. The Australians provided instructors to that school and to the LRRP training wing at the Van Keep Training Center. Some Australian SAS personnel even served on exchange with MACVSOG units. They saw American methods from the inside, and what they saw disturbed them. The fundamental disagreement was about speed. American doctrine prized rapid movement, get in, hit hard, get out, before the enemy could mass forces against you. This approach made sense in conventional warfare, where mobility meant survival. But in the triple canopy jungles of Vietnam, where visibility dropped to 10 or 15 meters, and the enemy had spent decades learning to use the terrain as a weapon, speed was not an asset. It was a death sentence. Australian SAS patrols moved at speeds that American observers found incomprehensible. Journalist Gerald Stone, who accompanied Australian troops in 1966, described the experience as frustrating beyond endurance. Patrols sometimes took as long as 9 hours to cover a single mile of terrain. They moved forward a few steps at a time, stopped, listened, then proceeded again. Each step was placed with surgical precision on ground that would not compress or snap or rustle. After each movement, the patrol froze, not for seconds but for minutes. During those minutes of absolute stillness, each man scanned his surroundings, using only his eyes, testing the air, listening with an intensity that bordered on predatory. They were not moving through the jungle, they were dissolving into it. This was the point that the Australians tried to explain to their Green Beret counterparts, and the point that was most consistently rejected. The Americans saw slow movement as cowardice or overcaution. The Australians saw it as the difference between coming home alive and coming home in a bag. The logic was brutal and irrefutable. American patrols moving at 2 or 3 kilometers per day generated a constant stream of detectable signatures, snapping branches, rustling vegetation, subtle vibrations transmitted through root systems that experienced Viet Cong listening posts were specifically trained to identify. A single broken twig could compromise an entire operation. The Viet Cong had studied American movement patterns for years. They knew the sounds American boots made on different terrain. They knew the rhythm of American patrol movement, the characteristic stop-start pattern of men moving too fast to be truly careful, but too cautious to be truly fast. At 100 to 200 meters per hour, no such signatures existed. The jungle's natural soundscape recovered completely between each movement. Birds continued singing. Insects maintained their droning chorus. Monkeys called without interruption. To enemy listening posts, an area where Australians operated sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. But the disagreement went deeper than movement speed. It extended to scent, to equipment, to footwear, to the fundamental question of how a soldier should relate to his operating environment. Every American soldier in Vietnam received a standard field hygiene kit: soap, deodorant, shaving cream, toothpaste, insect repellent. The United States Army considered personal cleanliness essential for discipline and morale. This logic had governed American military thinking since the Western Front in 1917, and the Viet Cong had learned to exploit it completely. Captured enemy fighters confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be detected by smell from more than 500 meters away. The chemical signature of American hygiene products was utterly alien to the jungle environment. Deodorant created scent trails that lingered for hours in the humid tropical air. The distinctive sweet tobacco of American cigarettes announced patrol positions to any enemy scout within a kilometer. The Australians had eliminated every chemical marker. Weeks before any patrol, SAS troopers stopped using soap entirely. They abandoned deodorant, shaving cream, and commercial toothpaste. They switched from American cigarettes to local tobacco, or quit smoking altogether. They ate indigenous food. By the time they inserted into the jungle, they smelled like the jungle itself, like decay and mud and wet vegetation. The practical result was that Viet Cong patrols routinely passed within meters of concealed Australian positions without detecting anything unusual. The Australians had made themselves chemically invisible. American officers who visited Nui Dat often recoiled at the state of the SAS troopers preparing for patrol. The smell was aggressive and biological. Their first assumption was always logistics failure or disciplinary breakdown. The Australians' response to this assumption carried an edge that tended to make an impression. The smell was not failure, it was doctrine, and it was the reason Australian soldiers came home alive. Then there were the weapons. Australian SAS carried the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a variant of the legendary FNFAL, one of the finest battle rifles ever manufactured, accurate to 400 meters, reliable in adverse conditions, and the Australians had taken hacksaws to them. They cut the barrels short, removing approximately 15 centimeters. They removed flash suppressors. They welded crude forward grips made from scrap metal or carved hardwood. The resulting weapon looked improvised and unprofessional. American ordnance specialists who examined these modifications were genuinely appalled. The Australians had destroyed the ballistics. They had reduced effective range by at least 60%, but effective range was irrelevant. In the Vietnamese jungle, average engagement distance was between 10 and 15 meters. A rifle accurate to 400 meters was useless when you could not see past 15. Worse, the full-length barrel constantly snagged on vines, bamboo, and undergrowth. Every snag required stopping, freeing the weapon, and resuming movement. Every stop created noise. Every noise could mean detection. The shortened weapon slid through vegetation without catching, and at 15 meters, the heavier 7.62 millimeter round delivered devastating stopping power that the American 5.56 millimeter M16 round could not match at close quarters. Research from the Australian Army Research Centre confirmed that the overwhelming majority of contacts in Phuoc Tuy Province occurred at extremely close range and lasted less than 20 minutes. The Australians had designed their weapons for the war they were actually fighting, not the war their manuals described. And then there were the sandals. Several Australian SAS troopers preparing for patrol wore Ho Chi Minh sandals, standard Viet Cong footwear manufactured from old automobile tires with straps cut from inner tubes. The reason was counter-tracking. Every military boot left distinctive impressions. American jungle boots had specific tread patterns recognizable to any experienced tracker. A Viet Cong scout who found American boot prints knew exactly what he was following. Numbers, direction of travel, approximate time since passage. By wearing captured enemy footwear, Australian patrols left tracks indistinguishable from Viet Cong movement. A tracker who found these prints would assume he was following friendly forces. He would not raise the alarm. This was not the only counter-tracking technique the Australians employed. They walked in streams when possible. They stepped on roots and rocks rather than soft earth. When crossing muddy areas, the last man in the patrol would brush out tracks using branches. These methods added time and complexity to movement, but they made Australian patrols nearly impossible to follow. The Viet Cong, who had tracked French colonial forces for years, who had tracked South Vietnamese army units with ease, who tracked American patrols almost at will, could not reliably track the Australians. When Green Beret officers received briefings on these methods, the reaction was often dismissive or hostile. Speed, aggression, and firepower had won World War II. They had held Korea. They had made America the dominant military power on Earth. The idea that patience might outperform aggression, that stillness might outperform movement, that adaptation might outperform technology. This was philosophically alien to institutions built on fundamentally different assumptions. Some Green Berets listened, most did not. The institutional resistance was not personal. It was cultural. And culture in warfare is the hardest thing to change. The consequences of this cultural gap were measured in blood. The statistical disparity between Australian and American special operations outcomes in Vietnam was not marginal. It was catastrophic. It suggested that one approach was functioning while another was failing. And the evidence came not only from friendly casualty figures, but from the enemy's own documentation. Captured Viet Cong documents revealed that the enemy had developed completely different tactical guidance for engaging Australian versus American forces. For Americans, the guidance emphasized predictability and vulnerability. American units used helicopter insertion, creating detectable noise signatures from kilometers away. American patrols moved at trackable speeds and left clear trails. American soldiers could be smelled from extreme distances. The recommended approach was aggressive ambush at carefully selected locations. Inflict maximum casualties in the first 30 seconds, then withdraw through prepared routes before artillery became effective. For Australians, the guidance was radically different. Australian patrols were acknowledged as extremely difficult to detect. They could not be smelled. They could not be heard. They could not be tracked. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their patience exceeded anything other Western forces had demonstrated. The recommended approach was avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush because Australians were more likely to detect the trap than to walk into it. Do not attempt pursuit because Australian counterattacking capabilities made such efforts potentially fatal. If contact was unavoidable, break it off as quickly as possible and withdraw. The contrast in these two sets of guidance, aggressively attack Americans, desperately avoid Australians, tells you everything about the relative effectiveness of the two approaches. The same enemy, operating in the same terrain during the same period of the war, had concluded that one Western force was prey and another was predator. The difference was not equipment or numbers or air support. It was methodology. The Viet Cong used a specific term for Australian soldiers that was applied to no other Allied force: rung, phantoms of the jungle. Jungle ghosts. The term carried connotations that went beyond ordinary military respect. The Viet Cong were not merely cautious about Australian forces. They were afraid in ways they were never afraid of Americans. According to some reports, a bounty of $5,000 was placed on the head of each Australian SAS operator, dead or alive. This fear had measurable operational consequences. Enemy activity in Phuoc Thai province, where Australian forces concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. American commanders noticed this disparity and demanded explanations. Perhaps the Australians were in less strategically important areas. Perhaps they were avoiding contact. Perhaps they were falsifying reports. The captured documents eliminated every alternative explanation. The enemy was explicitly instructing its forces to avoid Australian contact because Australians were more dangerous. The Australians' approach to contact, when it came, was itself a study in contrasts with American methodology. When an Australian SAS patrol detected enemy movement, they did not call for air support or request extraction. They repositioned, slowly, silently, with the same glacial patience that had brought them into position, and set up an ambush. The ambush itself was designed not merely to inflict casualties, but to send a message. The initial burst of fire was overwhelming, designed to simulate a force many times the patrol's actual size. Every weapon in the five-man patrol fired simultaneously, creating a wall of noise and lead that gave the enemy no time to assess the actual threat. Most contacts were over in seconds. The Australians would then break contact and melt back into the jungle before the enemy could organize a response. Research published by the Australian Army Research Centre confirmed that over 75% of all ambushes, patrol encounters, and security contacts conducted by the 1st Australian Task Force were completed in under 20 minutes. Many lasted less than 5. The Viet Cong tactic of hugging, closing to extremely close range to prevent the use of indirect fire support, worked against American units, but was far less effective against Australians who had designed their entire methodology around close-range engagement. At 10 to 15 meters, the heavier round from the shortened L1A1 was devastating. The Australians were not just prepared for close-quarters fighting, they had optimized for it. The psychological dimension of Australian operations was perhaps the most disturbing element for American observers. The Australians understood that in a guerrilla war, fear was as potent a weapon as a bullet. Their presence in an area, even when they made no contact at all, degraded enemy morale and operational effectiveness in ways that air strikes and artillery bombardments did not. A B-52 strike could destroy a hectare of jungle and kill everyone in it, but the survivors moved back in the next day. An Australian SAS patrol that operated unseen in an area for 2 weeks created a pervasive sense of dread that persisted long after the patrol extracted. The enemy never knew when the phantoms would return. They never knew where they were watching from. They never knew which trail had become a killing ground. This uncertainty was corrosive. It ate at discipline, at cohesion, at the willingness to conduct the routine patrols and logistics movements that sustained guerrilla operations. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep-and-clear operation supported by artillery and close air support. The depth of Australian methodology went beyond tactical innovation. It drew on knowledge systems that predated European contact with Australia by tens of thousands of years. The Australian SAS had integrated elements of Aboriginal tracking methodology into their operational doctrine through generations of collaboration that no other Western military had attempted. Aboriginal Australians had survived in demanding wilderness environments for over 40,000 years. Their accumulated knowledge of concealment, tracking, patient hunting, and environmental awareness represented the longest continuous tradition of such skills anywhere on Earth. This was not mysticism. It was intensely practical expertise refined through millennia of survival pressure. Aboriginal trackers could determine from a footprint not just direction of travel, but approximate weight, whether the person was carrying a load, whether they were injured, how long ago they had passed, and whether they were alert or relaxed. They could read broken vegetation the way literate people read text. They could detect human presence through absence, noticing when birds had stopped calling, or insects had gone silent in patterns that indicated intrusion. Australian SAS incorporated specific elements from this tradition. The concept of becoming part of the environment rather than moving through it as a foreign element. The practice of reading landscape features for information about recent activity, the discipline of absolute stillness that permitted observation without detection, the patience that could sustain focused attention for hours without the restlessness that Western military training struggled to eliminate. American military culture had no equivalent foundation, and without that foundation, the techniques were almost impossible to replicate. General William Westmoreland himself reportedly complained to Australian Major General Tim Vincent that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough. This criticism reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Australians were doing. The American definition of aggression was kinetic, more operations, more contact, more bodies. The Australian definition of aggression was strategic. Dominate your area of operation so completely that the enemy cannot function within it. One approach measured activity, the other measured outcomes. The Australians heard this criticism and noted, with characteristic understatement, that their casualty rates were a fraction of American figures in equivalent operations. Aggressiveness, they suggested, was not the same thing as effectiveness. The body count mentality that drove American operations in Vietnam was not merely a flawed metric. It was an actively destructive one, because it incentivized the very behaviors that got American soldiers killed. Moving fast, making contact, generating noise and signature in pursuit of numbers that looked good in reports but changed nothing on the ground. The Australian approach to personnel selection reinforced the philosophical gap. SAS selection was not primarily a physical test, although the physical demands were extreme. It was a psychological evaluation designed to identify a specific personality profile: men with high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition, and what psychologists termed predatory patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining complete situational awareness, the willingness to act with explosive violence after extended periods of inactivity, the capacity to function independently in environments where help was days away. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered a training program lasting 18 months, 3 times longer than the American Special Forces qualification course of the same era. A significant portion of that training took place not in jungle warfare schools, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking and field craft from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written down because they predated written language by millennia. Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated American soldiers of the Vietnam War, holder of 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 10 Silver Stars, and 8 Purple Hearts, understood what the Australians were doing better than most of his countrymen. General Creighton Abrams himself called Hackworth the best battalion commander I ever saw in the United States Army. Hackworth had created Tiger Force in 1965, a platoon-sized unit within the 101st Airborne designed to fight the Viet Cong using their own guerrilla tactics. He had co-written the Vietnam Primer with General S.L.A. Marshall, a field manual that advocated for the adoption of insurgent methods against the insurgency. He called the strategy out-G-ing the G, out-guerrillaing the guerrillas. Hackworth had observed Australian operations firsthand and recognized immediately that they had solved the problem he had been wrestling with for years: small units, patient movement, environmental adaptation, the subordination of ego to effectiveness. He advocated relentlessly for these principles within the American chain of command. He was ignored, sidelined, and eventually driven out. In June 1971, Colonel Hackworth went on ABC television and told the American public that the war could not be won with the tactics being employed, that military leaders had failed to understand the nature of the conflict, and that Saigon would fall within 5 years. He was right about all of it. His reward was forced retirement and professional exile. He moved to Australia, a choice whose symbolism was not lost on anyone who knew the story. He lived there for years, running restaurants and a property business, until eventually returning to the United States to continue his fight as a journalist and military critic until his death in 2005. The MACVSOG Recondo School at Unheard represented one of the few institutional bridges where American and Australian methods actually merged. Established in September 1966 at General Westmoreland's direction, the school was built on the foundation of Project Delta's reconnaissance training program. Australian SAS personnel served as instructors and liaisons there, alongside Green Beret cadre who were themselves among the most experienced reconnaissance soldiers in the American military. The school also provided instruction at the LRRP training wing at the Von Keep Training Center from 1967 onward. Some Australian SAS personnel even served on exchange with MACVSOG units, operating alongside American soldiers on cross-border missions. Over the school's 4-year existence, more than 5,600 soldiers attended training. Approximately 3,500 graduated, a failure rate that exceeded 1/3. The 20-day course crammed over 300 hours of instruction into a punishing schedule that began at 4 in the morning and rarely ended before dark. Students learned map reading, intelligence, gathering, weapons proficiency with both Allied and enemy firearms, communications, medical procedures, including intravenous injections, and forward air control techniques, calling in live ordnance on targets. They practiced helicopter insertion and extraction, immediate action drills, and every facet of long-range patrol craft. The final exam was not a simulation. It was an actual combat patrol in enemy territory. In the early years of the program, contact with the enemy during the graduation patrol was possible, but not certain. As the war intensified, contact became virtually guaranteed. At least 2 students were killed during these patrols, and an unknown number of Viet Cong died in the skirmishes. Students took to calling the graduation exercise "You Bet Your Life." The school's unofficial nickname became the deadliest school on earth. The cadre were triple volunteers, men who had volunteered for the Army, for Airborne, and for Special Forces. They were among the finest soldiers America had produced, and the Australian instructors who worked alongside them earned their respect quickly and completely. 18 Australians graduated from the Recondo course themselves, alongside hundreds of Koreans, Thais, Vietnamese, and Filipinos. The school produced a generation of American LRRP and Ranger operators who carried its lessons into the jungle and, in many cases, survived because of them. But even at the Recondo school, the deeper lessons struggled to take root. American students learned techniques. They learned immediate action drills and patrol formations and extraction procedures. What they could not absorb in 3 weeks was the psychological transformation that took Australian SAS operators 18 months of training to achieve. The willingness to suppress every instinct that said move faster, shoot first, rely on firepower. The techniques could be taught. The philosophy could not be transferred through a curriculum. The tragedy was compounded by The institutional response. Reports filed by American observers who witnessed Australian methods and recommended adoption were stamped, classified, and buried. The Pentagon was not interested in evidence suggesting that American doctrine was producing failure, while a force of 150 men from a country most Americans couldn't find on a map was producing success. The political implications were uncomfortable. The moral implications, that American soldiers were dying preventable deaths because their own institutions refused to learn, were unbearable. The lessons did eventually penetrate American special operations doctrine, but the delay was measured in decades and lives. When the United States military began serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, driven by catastrophic failures like the Desert One hostage rescue attempt in Iran, many of the principles that were incorporated had been demonstrated effective by Australians in the 1960s. Emphasis on small unit tactics and individual operator judgment, prioritization of stealth and patience over firepower and aggression, understanding that environmental adaptation could achieve results that technology alone could not deliver. The establishment of the United States Special Operations Command in 1987 represented an institutional acknowledgment that unconventional warfare required unconventional thinking, the very argument the Australians had made 20 years earlier. The development of the M4 carbine, with its shorter 14.5-inch barrel that became standard issue for American Special Operations Forces, was directly influenced by the jungle warfare experience, including the Australian practice of cutting down their L1A1 rifles for close-quarter effectiveness in dense terrain. The philosophy behind the modification was identical. A shorter weapon that sacrificed long-range precision for close-quarters handling was superior in environments where engagement distances were measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the entire apparatus of American unconventional warfare incorporated training methodologies and operational philosophies that the Australian SAS had pioneered and validated under fire. The irony is as sharp as it is bitter. The lessons were available in 1966. They were documented. They were demonstrated. The Australians shared them freely, and the American military establishment took roughly 20 years to integrate what it could have adopted in months. The cost of that delay cannot be precisely calculated, but it can be estimated in thousands of men who might have come home, in thousands of families who might have remained whole, in thousands of lives that might have continued past the jungles of Southeast Asia. But the human cost of institutional stubbornness cannot be recovered. Every ambush that might have been avoided, every patrol that was detected because its members smelled like a department store, every recon team that was tracked because its boot prints were as readable as a signature, every man who came home in an aluminum box because his doctrine told him to move at 2 kilometers per day through jungle, where 100 meters per hour was the speed of survival. And there was a cost on the Australian side as well, one that no kill ratio could measure and no after-action report could capture. The men who learned to become invisible, who trained themselves to suppress every recognizable human behavior pattern, who existed for weeks in a state of pure sensory awareness with the normal operations of human consciousness deliberately suspended, those men paid a price that followed them home. The transformation required to operate at that level was not something that could be switched off when the patrol ended. Veterans of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam reported difficulties readjusting to civilian life. that went beyond what conventional post-traumatic stress models predicted. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive in the jungle persisted for years and decades after service ended. Men who had trained themselves to process every sound, every scent, every shift of light as potential threat information could not stop processing when they came home. Supermarkets were overwhelming. Traffic noise was unbearable. The emotional suppression that had made them invisible to enemy scouts made them strangers to their own families. Wives could not reach them. Children grew up with fathers who were physically present but psychologically distant, men who had learned to shut down the parts of themselves that made them human in order to survive environments where being human was a liability. The ability to remain motionless and silent for hours, which had been a survival mechanism in the jungle, became something between a habit and a prison in suburban living rooms where the world was too loud, too bright, too chaotic to process. Some veterans described the experience as having learned to think like an animal, not metaphorically savage, but literally shedding human thought patterns that interfered with survival. In the jungle, this state of pure sensory awareness was tactically invaluable. At home, it was a cage. The Viet Cong called them rung, jungle ghosts. But ghosts are creatures caught between worlds, neither fully present in one realm nor able to return to another. Some Australian SAS veterans found themselves similarly suspended, not fully present in the civilian world they returned to, unable to forget the jungle world they had inhabited. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans eventually exceeded those of their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining far fewer combat casualties. The same transformation that made them devastatingly effective made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to become predators, and predators do not easily return to the herd. The jungle had its own morality. It rewarded what worked and punished what did not. That morality was not always compatible with the morality of the civilization these soldiers came from, and the dissonance between the two worlds followed them for the rest of their lives. The modern Special Operations Community studies Australian SAS methods from Vietnam as foundational doctrine. What was once dismissed as primitive is now taught at Fort Liberty and Coronado. The tracker programs, the psychological warfare techniques, the long-range patrol methodology, all have been incorporated into training curricula used by the world's most capable special forces units. In Afghanistan and Iraq, American special operators employed techniques of environmental adaptation, cultural immersion, and patient intelligence gathering that would have been immediately recognizable to any Australian SAS trooper who served in Foch, Tui Province. The wheel had not been reinvented. It had simply been rediscovered, half a century late. Yet something remains elusive in the translation. Modern special operations can replicate Australian tactics. They can teach the techniques of scent elimination and slow movement and counter-tracking. What they struggle to replicate is the psychology, the transformation that turns ordinary men into something the jungle cannot distinguish from itself. The willingness to become something other than a conventional soldier, the acceptance that effective survival requires becoming a hunter in your soul, not merely in your training. The Australian tradition of small wars, from the Boer War, through the Malayan Emergency, through Borneo, through Vietnam, created an institutional memory that valued adaptation, patience, and fieldcraft over firepower and mass. That memory cannot be transplanted. It can only be grown, slowly, through decades of hard experience, through willingness to Let the environment teach, rather than insisting that the environment submit. The Battle of Longtain in August 1966 had shown that Australian conventional forces could fight with extraordinary courage and tactical skill when pressed into a desperate engagement. But the SAS contribution was different in kind. It was not about courage in the face of the enemy. Every soldier in Vietnam, American and Australian alike, demonstrated that. It was about the discipline to make the enemy irrelevant by denying him the ability to find you, track you, or predict your movements. It was about the humility to accept that 40,000 years of Aboriginal knowledge might be more valuable in the jungle than $40 billion of American military technology. The Green Berets who dismissed the Australians as amateurs, who walked out of that briefing at Nui Dat, who muttered jokes about emus. They were not bad soldiers. They were products of a system that told them what they already believed, that American methods were the best because America was the best, that more firepower solved every problem, that speed and aggression would always triumph. These were not unreasonable beliefs. They had been validated by American military history for generations. They just happened to be catastrophically wrong for the specific environment where these men were being asked to fight and die. The Australian sergeant who told those Green Berets that their tactics would kill them was not being provocative. He was being precise. He had watched American recon teams walk into ambushes that Australian patrols would have detected and avoided. He had listened to radio traffic from American units being systematically destroyed, while Australian patrols operated in the same jungle without detection. He had seen the numbers. He knew what they meant, and he knew that the men sitting across from him were going to go back to their units, do exactly what they had always done, and some of them were going to die for it. He was right. They did go back. They did continue with American methods, and some of them did die. The arithmetic of patience over firepower, the mathematics of adaptation over technology, the calculus of becoming what the environment requires rather than demanding the environment accommodate what you prefer to be. These were the equations the Australians had solved, and the Americans refused to learn. 1,200 patrols, 500 enemy killed, 6 friendly dead across 6 years. Not luck, not favorable terrain, not statistical anomaly. That was what happened when soldiers stopped fighting the jungle and started becoming part of it. The Pentagon knew the numbers. They classified them. The enemy knew the numbers. They feared them. The survivors knew the numbers. They owed their lives to them. Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, the soldiers who were dismissed as primitives until they proved themselves masters, the ghosts who tried to teach the men who mocked them. The lesson was there for the taking. The institutions were not willing to learn. 50 years later, the question remains the same. Not whether the lesson is available, it always has been, but whether those who need it most will ever be willing to accept it. The Australian SAS answered that question in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province more than half a century ago. The institutions that ignored them are still formulating their response. And somewhere in the classified archives of 2 nations, the after-action reports remain. Testimony to what was possible, what was rejected, and what was lost, because pride could not bend to evidence. The arithmetic does not lie. It never did. 150 men, 1,200 patrols, 6 dead across 6 years of war. The numbers were always there. The willingness to learn from them was not.